This is the 8th training video for the CARE program for Lesson 8, which is called Different Perspectives. If you take a look at the teacher manual and turn to the Lesson 8 lesson plan, you can see that the only materials you will need for this lesson is a student workbook and that self-monitoring worksheet that students have been filling out every week as they self-monitor that identified situation. We're going to start Lesson 8 in a very similar way to previous lessons. Start by briefly practicing a relaxation strategy, whether it's 30 seconds of calm breathing or muscle relaxation with choosing 3 to 4 muscles to focus on. Next, go ahead and review that self-monitoring sheet with students. So have them look at their sheet, see if any students notice any changes in their ratings, either moving up and down, and have students reflect on what might have caused those changes. Next, go ahead and have students review that short-term goal that they set at the end of Lesson 7 and fill out that reflection question. And then finally, review the homework from Lesson 7. If you remember, Lesson 7 was about identifying triggers, and the homework asked students to identify triggers for being sad and worried at school. So as time permits, and if students are comfortable, have them share 1 or 2 triggers at school that might make them sad and 1 or 2 triggers that might make them worried, and then continue to emphasize to students that not everyone has the same triggers, and that is okay. Okay, so once that is complete, you can go ahead and get started with Lesson 8, which is called Different Perspectives. And so the lesson goals for Lesson 8 are to discuss how different people may have different perspectives and to practice recognizing people's perspectives. Okay, and so the first thing you're going to do is have students turn to page 54 of the student workbook and take a look at the picture that is there. And without talking to a neighbor or anybody else, have students write down what they see when they look at that picture. And once everyone has had a chance to write down what they see, have students share what they've written down. And so you might notice that some students might see a rocky cliff, and other students might see the profile of a face and the rocks. And so the profile, here's the forehead here, here's the nose, and then here's the chin. And then some students might see something else. But you can emphasize to students that sometimes we might view the same situation in different ways, just like we viewed this picture in different ways. And that's what's called having a perspective. And so you can kind of use this as a way to introduce our main concept, which is perspective. And what is a perspective? And so page 55 of the student workbook introduces the concept of perspective, empathy, and how that can be helpful, how these concepts can be helpful when we are working with other people and interacting with other people. So you can define perspective for students and let students know that when we look at someone else's perspective, it can help us understand how other people see a situation, and that a lot of times people might have a different perspective over the same event. So, you know, if you are really excited for a play your class is presenting, that's great, but your friend might be scared and wishing the play was already over. And so when we understand someone else's perspective, it can also help us have empathy for others. So if I understand that, you know, my friend is scared and wishing the play is already over, and she's not talking a lot and not excited about this, and she doesn't want to practice with me. When I understand where she's coming from, she's not excited about this. She's really scared. It can help me understand where she's coming from, and it can help me have empathy for her. And then you can review with students, again, that it can also be helpful to understand people's perspective and use empathy if we're working to manage our anger. And so there's some examples here. And then you can have students think of other situations where it would be good to understand perspective and empathy. Next, we've got 2 examples that students are going to be able to look at to practice understanding other people's perspectives. So we've got two cartoons here, one on page 56 and one on page 57. You'll see there's a cartoon, and then there'll be a little text box that kind of sets up the situation so students know what's going on. So in the first one, we have Momo behind Amy in the lunch line. Amy's moving very slowly through the line, and Momo has to wait to get his food. And so you can have students trying to identify what each character is thinking, so what is their perspective, and then kind of guide students through a conversation on why is it important for those two characters to understand each other's perspective, and if one character, either Momo or Amy, wasn't thinking about the other person's perspective, how might that situation turn out, versus if they were both trying to think about the other person's perspective and understand that. And then on page 57, we've got our next situation here where we have Momo coming in from recess, and he's going to drop his coat on the ground next to his desk, and his teacher is going to ask him to pick it up. And as you can see from the cartoon here, Momo is not too happy about being given that direction. So again, have students identify what Miss Applebaum is thinking, and then have them identify what Momo is thinking and why it's important for these characters to understand perspective. Okay, and then next, on page 58, we have some scenarios here where students are going to be able to do some perspective practice with some role playing. And so with this, we're going to role play. There's two situations on the page. We've got a scenario 1 and scenario 2. If you only have time to do one scenario, that's fine. Just choose a scenario you think would work best for your students. We wanted to make sure you had some choice. And so what's going to happen is you're going to choose a student to play the role of student A. And then you, as the teacher or the coach, you are going to play the role of student B in this scenario. And you, as student B, are going to react in a kind of a surprising way. So you're not going to react in a way where a student might expect. And the idea is to not let the students know how the teacher is going to respond. So to make it kind of more realistic of what might actually happen in the classroom. So for example here, this first situation, we have the teachers asking students to color the states of color the map with states, and they're supposed to color the states you've already been to in blue, states you want to go to in green, and so it's time to get out colored pencils, and student A realizes they're missing their blue colored pencil, and so they're going to ask the student next to them, which is going to be you, playing the teacher, to borrow a blue colored pencil. So student A is going to ask, hey, can I borrow a blue colored pencil? And you, playing student B, are going to react by saying, no, these are mine. I don't want you to use my blue colored pencil. And even if student A tries to convince you to let them use the pencil, you're going to continue to say no. And then go ahead and stop the scenario and have students try and identify the perspective of student A, which is going to be played by one of your students, and then student B, which is played by yourself. And so as you think about how you want to set this up with your students, we just suggest that you really think about who you want to play student A. It should be somebody who is going to react well to being told no. Or you might want to pull that student aside, talk to them beforehand and say, hey, we're going to do this role-playing thing, and you're going to ask to borrow a blue colored pencil, and I'm going to be kind of mean back and be like, no, you can't have my colored pencil, so they know what's coming. Because you definitely don't want to surprise a student and put them in a situation that might make them angry or uncomfortable. But again, the whole point of this scenario and this role play is to give students an example of a time where, first of all, it might be important to identify a different perspective, and then have a realistic response, because when students are are interacting with each other, it's not always going to be they're not always going to be faced with a nice response. And so kind of giving them a real life example of a situation where they might need to stop and think about someone else's perspective and why they're reacting in this way that they don't really like can be really helpful. And the goal here is to do it in a way to give students that visual and let them see this role playing without it turning into something that's going to be very negative. And there's a second scenario there too that you can use if you want to. But like I said, do at least one scenario. If you have time to do two, that's great. Once you finish going through the role-playing scenarios there, it's time to set our goal of the week. So have students set that short-term goal. Have them write down steps they need to take to reach their goal. And then it's time to review the Lesson 8 homework. The Lesson 8 homework is some more cartoons where students are going to identify different perspectives of our two characters here. So we've got Derek and Momo here, and then there's going to be one more cartoon where we have Momo and Emily. And so have students identify what each character is thinking in those cartoons. And that's it for Lesson 8. Don't forget to send home that parent letter. And that is it.